Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, there were once people who could look at a persimmon seed and prepare for winter, walk across a field with a forked branch and find water, or keep meat safe for months without a refrigerator. To outsiders, some of these skills sounded like superstition, but to mountain families, they were not stories. They were tools for staying alive when the road was frozen, the store was far away, and help did not always come in time. For generations, families across Appalachia lived with a kind of knowledge that was rarely written down. It was carried in the hands of grandparents, in the smoke of old kitchens, in the smell of a curing shed, in the quiet way a farmer watched the sky before sunset. These were not tricks for entertainment. They were practical skills shaped by poverty, isolation, harsh weather, and a deep relationship with the land. Today, many of them are fading, not because they stopped working, but because the world that needed them has almost disappeared. One reading persimmon seeds. Every autumn in some mountain communities, people once waited for ripe persimmons to fall before making a quiet prediction about the winter ahead. The seed was cut open, and the shape inside was studied carefully. A spoon meant heavy snow, a knife meant sharp cold wind, a fork suggested a milder winter. To someone raised far from the mountains, it may sound like an old wives' tale, but for families who lived through winters without easy roads or modern forecasts, any sign from nature mattered. The real importance of this skill was not whether every prediction came true. It was that people paid attention before winter arrived. A family that expected a hard season would stack more firewood, store more food, protect animals earlier, and repair weak parts of the house before the cold settled in. The persimmon seed was less about magic and more about preparation. It reminded people that winter was not something to react to at the last minute. It was something to respect months in advance. And once winter was expected, the next question was even more basic. Where would the water come from? 2. Water witching. Before modern well maps and drilling equipment became common in rural areas, many Appalachian families called on a local water witch to find underground water. The dowser would walk the land with a forked branch, often from peach, willow, or another flexible wood, and wait for the branch to pull downward. Some people dismissed it. Others trusted it because they had seen wells dug where the branch pointed and watched water rise from the ground. For mountain families, water was not a convenience. It was the center of the household. Without a reliable well or spring, there was no garden, no livestock, no washing, no cooking, and no real security. Whether water witching worked through instinct, experience, subtle land reading, or belief, the role it played was serious. A person who could help find water could change the future of a homestead. But finding water was only one part of survival. In the mountains, fire was just as important. 3. Making fire without matches. In Appalachia, fire was not simply something that warmed a room. It cooked food, dried clothes, boiled water, kept children safe through the night, and turned a dark cabin into a place where a family could gather. Before matches and lighters were always available, people had to understand how to protect coals, keep tinder dry, and restart flame when everything around them was cold and damp. Older generations did not treat fire-making as a dramatic survival challenge. It was part of ordinary knowledge. A child might learn where to find dry bark under wet trees, which wood caught quickly, and how to carry an ember from one place to another. The skill mattered because in the mountains, cold was not an inconvenience. It could become dangerous quickly. A person who could make fire had a way to fight back against darkness, wet weather, and freezing nights. And once a fire was burning, families still had to watch the sky, because the mountains could change the weather without warning. 4. Reading the Blue Ridge sky. Long before radar and phone alerts, Appalachian farmers read the weather by looking at the ridges. Fog sitting low in the valley, clouds catching on a mountain peak, a red evening sky, the direction of the wind, or the sudden silence of birds could all mean something. These signs were not learned in a single season. They came from decades of watching the same mountains behave in the same patterns. This skill mattered because weather controlled nearly everything. Hay had to be cut before rain. Firewood had to be brought in before snow. A family had to know when to protect crops, when to move animals, and when to stay close to home. In a place where roads could become mud, ice, or washed out stone, a wrong guess could cost food, time, or safety. To read the sky was to read the calendar before it turned against you. And when the weather turned cold, the most important question became whether enough food had been saved. 5. Smokehouse curing. Behind many old mountain homes, there once stood a small dark building that carried the smell of salt, smoke, and winter survival. The smokehouse was not built for flavor alone. It was where a successful hog harvest became food that could last for months. Before refrigerators and freezers changed rural life, families had to preserve meat carefully or lose one of their most valuable resources. The person who understood the smokehouse carried heavy responsibility. They knew when meat needed more salt, when the air was too warm, when the smoke was right, and when patience mattered more than speed. A smokehouse turned autumn labor into winter meals. It meant ham on the table, bacon in the skillet, and protein when the garden was frozen. In many homes, the smokehouse was not a luxury. It was the difference between a hard winter and a desperate one. But not every winter food came from meat. Some of the most remembered Appalachian traditions came from fruit, fire, and a long day of stirring. 6 apple butter gatherings. In many Appalachian communities, making apple butter was more than a kitchen task. It was a gathering. Families peeled, sliced, cooked, and stirred apples for hours in large kettles, often outside over a fire. The work was slow, and the person holding the paddle had to keep moving because one careless pause could scorch the bottom and ruin the batch. Apple butter mattered because apples were one of the gifts of autumn that could be stretched deep into winter. A jar on the shelf brought sweetness to biscuits, cornbread, and simple meals when store-bought sugar was not something to waste. But the tradition also mattered because it brought people together. Neighbors shared work, stories, food, and memory around the kettle. In a mountain life often shaped by isolation, Apple Butter Day reminded people that survival was not always done alone. And while apple trees fed the family, another sweet harvest waited higher in the ridges for only a short time each year. 7. Sourwood. Honey sourwood. Honey is one of Appalachia's most treasured mountain foods, and part of its value comes from timing. The sourwood tree blooms for a short period, often in the heat of summer, and beekeepers had to understand when the nectar flow was beginning and when it was about to end. Miss the window, and the honey could change as bees moved to other flowers. For old Appalachian beekeepers, this was not just about selling a rare honey. It was about knowing the land closely enough to move with it. They watched blossoms, weather, elevation, and bee behavior. Pure sourwood honey became a reward for attention. It showed that the beekeeper understood not just the hive, but the mountain itself. Today, people may buy honey in a jar without thinking about the season behind it. But in the old way, one jar could hold weeks of watching, waiting, and knowing exactly when to act. And not all valuable things in the mountains came from trees or hives. Some were hidden low on the forest floor. 8. Sang hunting. Wild ginseng, often called sang in the mountains, became one of the most valuable plants in Appalachian forests. Experienced hunters knew where to look: shaded slopes, rich soil, hardwood trees, and places that did not reveal themselves to careless eyes. A true sang hunter did not simply dig every plant he found. He knew when the root was mature, how to lift it without breaking it, and why berries had to be replanted so the patch could live on. This skill mattered because it blended survival, income, and respect for the land. For some families, sang money helped pay debts, buy supplies, or carry them through a difficult season. But the old rules were important. Take too much, and the patch disappears. Dig too young, and the future is stolen. The best hunters were not just good at finding ginseng, they were good at leaving enough behind. And in spring, before ginseng season arrived, another wild plant brought mountain families into the woods. 9 ramp foraging ramps, the wild leeks of Appalachia, appear for only a short time in spring. Their smell is strong, their season is brief, and their patches were often guarded like family secrets. For many mountain families, ramps were one of the first fresh foods after a long winter of stored meat, beans, cornmeal, and preserved fruit. The important part of ramp knowledge was restraint. Older harvesters often took carefully, leaving enough behind so the patch could return the next year. Ramps were not just food. They were a sign that the earth was waking again. A meal cooked with ramps meant winter had loosened its grip, and the woods were beginning to feed the people once more. Today, Ramps have become fashionable in restaurants, but the old mountain way understood something modern. Demand often forgets. If you take the whole patch, there is no tradition left to inherit. And some spring plants were even more complicated because they could feed you only if you knew exactly how to handle them. 10. Pokeweed spring greens. Pokeweed is one of the most controversial plants in Appalachian food memory. Many people know it as poisonous, and that warning is serious. But older mountain families also remembered young poke shoots as a spring green that had to be prepared with great care. The knowledge was not casual. It involved timing, age of the plant, repeated boiling, and caution passed down from someone who had done it many times before. The reason this tradition mattered is that spring hunger was real. After winter, stored food could be low, and fresh greens were deeply valued. Pokeweed represented a kind of knowledge that modern people often find uncomfortable. The line between food and danger can be thin, and older communities survived by learning exactly where that line was. This is not a skill to imitate without expert guidance, but as history, it shows how carefully mountain families studied the plants around them. And pokeweed was not the only plant connected to old mountain healing traditions. 11. White willow remedies. Long before pharmacies became common in remote Appalachian communities, families often relied on local plants for everyday aches and fevers. White willow bark was one of the best-known remedies. People brewed it into a bitter tea and passed the knowledge down through generations. The value of this skill was not replacing doctors. It was giving families something they could use when help was hours away and money was scarce. Mountain people learned that nature could provide comfort, but only when treated with knowledge and respect. And while some old skills focused on health, others helped entire communities survive on simple foods. 12. Making lye hominy. For generations, corn was one of the most important foods in Appalachia. But mountain families knew that turning corn into hominy made it far more useful and nourishing than simply grinding it into meal. Hominy became a staple that could appear on the table in many different forms, helping families stretch limited supplies through long seasons. It was a reminder that survival often depended on knowing how to get the most from the crops you already had. And when corn filled the pantry, pork often filled the smokehouse. 13 salt-cured pork. Before refrigeration reached rural America, preserving meat was one of the most important skills a family could have. Salt-cured pork allowed Appalachian households to store food for months after butchering season ended. A successful cure meant security through winter. A failed cure meant losing valuable food when it was needed most. That is why curing meat became a skill respected across the mountains and passed down through generations. But Appalachian survival was never only about food. 14 bee gum hives. Long before modern beehives became standard, some mountain beekeepers kept bees in hollow sections of tree trunks known as bee gums. These simple hives reflected a close relationship between people and nature. Honey provided sweetness when sugar was expensive, while bees helped orchards and gardens thrive. For many families, beekeeping was not simply a source of food. It was part of a way of life built around observation, patience, and respect for the land. And perhaps no Appalachian tradition captured the spirit of the mountains more clearly than the final skill. 15. Building the mountain dulcimer. The mountain dulcimer became one of the most recognizable symbols of Appalachian culture. Built by hand and played on porches, in churches, and at community gatherings, it carried stories and memories from one generation to the next. More than a musical instrument, the dulcimer represented creativity, craftsmanship, and identity. As fewer people learned to build them by hand, an important piece of Appalachian heritage slowly fades away. The people of Appalachia faced long winters, hard work, and isolation. But they also carried skills that helped them adapt and endure. They learned how to read nature, preserve food, find resources, and make use of what the land provided. Today, many of those traditions survive only in stories and memories. Yet they continue to fascinate us because they remind us of a time when survival depended less on technology and more on knowledge, patience, and experience. The question is, how many of these skills will still be remembered when the last generation who learned them firsthand is gone?